classroom or your learning environment and did it in a vivid way really met one of the expectations for Case 1, that is, giving us a picture of what you do. And many, many of you did that very, very well. Sometimes your structure wasn't always as clear as other times. Remember we talked about it's hard to get in, it's hard to get out, the middle's usually fine. So we'll be working today on how do you set up a structure so that your reader really knows where you're going and can follow you all the way there.
What I saw in the papers that I assessed was there was a mix between people who gave really clear and robust explanations of their work site and their learners versus other people who maybe really glossed over it. So that was some of my feedback to some of my students in terms of if we go back to the premise of the paper, that our audience is that scholar who's collecting data from a lot of places, that person would have not had any point of reference or context for some of the case studies that I read. So that's an area to pay attention to. And it's okay to be explicit in terms of, in my particular setting, my learners are my colleagues and my manager, or my customers and the administration. I don't know if people have a reluctance to be that explicit, but it is okay, and that helps us to understand and follow along what you're saying.
I had one adult ed case that was really good that way. It talked about two levels of learners, the people who work with customers and then the customers themselves. And in many, many settings where you're training people to go out and do something, you may be training that group, and you also may be having people come in, especially if it's a tech thing. People come in for the kind of support that you have. And they are really different kinds of audiences. And the person I'm thinking of did a really good job of saying what are the needs of each of those groups. So she created a very vivid picture. Desiree?
Well, and here, wait, Barb, here, be my camera person. One of the things that I saw as a trend, people working on developing a kind of balance between showing and telling. And so sometimes I really felt like I was walking down the hallway with somebody or accompanying them through their day, and other times I felt like I was hearing about it, and there was somehow like a question of distance from the lived experience that came through in some of the pieces. There was, I think, not so much different sets of learners, because I think that in general the people whose work I read have kind of a bounded set of learners whom they serve. But I think particularly for the folks who are in special ed settings, I heard people talking about different domains in which they serve their learners. And I thought that was effective because I felt like those domains were described pretty well. I think in general, like I saw and called attention to some issues of grammar and spelling and polish, and I think that we're all refining our craft as writers in this regard. And sometimes it feels like, okay, I'm just going to get this out here, especially in my first attempt, and kind of see how it goes. But I really just want to say that, you know, to everybody who I'm working with, that's, you know, we're in this journey together, and I'm going to name things when I see them, not because it's like a scolding, but because I want you to be excellent writers, you know, just really, really excellent writers, because I want you to be able to share stories about your practice with the world.
Apropos of that, I want to, Lynn?
Unfortunately, I couldn't make the last week, and I sent it all electronically,
Right.
but it's not in my folder.
No, it's also electronically back to you, so if you go to Educator, you'll see it there. Yeah,
all
no worries.
of the stuff I sent?
Yes.
With comments?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. No worries.
However you send it to us, we send it back the same way.
Right.
Desiree wants to work with Educator, Carol and I do straight email.
Right.
So we'll get that all straight. You can come at the break and look at it.
I'd be happy to show you where it is.
Apropos, though, of some of those things, I think there were things that cut across that we could do a little talking about. The first is, there, you know, in spite of I practically stand on my head saying, say I believe, make it explicit. There were some folks who never said I believe. And so it was really hard to know what their beliefs were. You could infer them, but I wasn't really clear. And so some of the things that we want to reinforce as we talk about case 2 is make clear what your main points are and hammer them harder than you think you need to, so that your reader really hears and understands.
Another thing that I noticed was, particularly in K-12, when you're setting context, I think almost everybody whose work I read had a kind of wins paragraph. You know, here's the socioeconomic status of my school, here's the context, here's how many free reduced lunch people there are. And I think in terms of, I understand that to set context, but it was a little jarring then in some cases to move into sort of the personal experience of the day. So in terms of, yeah, well, transitions, but also kind of maintaining a consistent voice throughout your piece, so that if you need to accomplish telling something and conveying a sense of context, to do it, I felt like almost like, okay, this should have been an insert chart that could have been listed from wins, and then I could have heard your story, because they were almost different in that sense.
With regard to some of the things that we want you to think about for grammar structure conventions, and I just saw this in a professional piece yesterday, so this is something that lots of people have trouble with, is parallel construction. If you say, I'm going to give you a list of things, and then one of them is an ing word, and another one is an infinitive. You know, I want to talk about what's important in my work, participating with others to set a clear context in the administration of the project. It's like one of those was an ing, one was an infinitive, and one was a noun. So make things in parallel construction so that your reader says, okay, I get it. The list of 3 things all look alike, so I can follow where they are. Alternatively, if you say 3 things, you could have 1 this, 2 that, 3 the other, but they should still be in parallel construction. Another is when you have an introductory phrase, what follows the comma has to be whatever the introductory phrase is about. So that if I said, for instance, serving as the Dean of Education, many things are important in the scene in which I work. Well, it's like many things don't serve as the Dean of Education. You know, or headquartered in Green Bay, we all love the Packers. It's like, what's headquartered in Green Bay? So just put in the back of your head, when you have something introducing and there's a comma, make sure that what follows the comma is what you're talking about.
I think also particularly, and I don't know, I would assume that this is true for people who are developing adults in corporate settings. You do a lot of talking as part of your work. I know it's true of K-12. And so I think that sometimes when you're getting going with writing, you write things down the way you would say them to somebody. And then I think that what I want to encourage people to do is to revisit that and see how well that works for you as a written piece. Because I think sometimes the ways in which we speak, especially if we're talking to audiences of children, is maybe more clipped kind of sentences as opposed to developing your thinking and into a more complicated idea.
And here's an example too. When you have a question, there are 2 ways to put it into a sentence. We might say, Desiree asked Lynn, did you get my feedback? But we could, then that would be in quotation marks. But if she said, Desiree asked Lynn whether she got the feedback, it's not in quotation marks. And sometimes you flip the structure of the sentence. And there were at least 2 people who had a little trouble with that. They had the non-quotation, but the quotation format, and that will throw a reader off. Some little tiny things. When you talk about people, say who rather than that. So the person who served me my coffee this morning, not the person that served me my coffee. And again, that may be the difference between oral and written, although I'd encourage you to do it in oral too.
I saw some misapplication of whom also. So just, and sometimes I feel like, oh, okay, I'm writing a piece, I better get whom in there. But that would be, you're using it in the sense of to whom, of whom. It needs, yes, exactly, as opposed to, I talked to Mary whom told me the following things. It's something that a lot of people do if they're trying to fancy it up.
When you're talking along a ways and then you say, this really is an important thing, and you've talked about 6 things, the reader doesn't know which of those things you're pointing back to, and especially if you talked about plural things, when it might be these. So my advice is always put another word behind this, unless it's so clear you couldn't miss it. So you might say, this last practice that I described is a highlight of my performance. Just put a noun with the this, so your reader knows how much of what you went before you're pointing at. And try never to use the word feel when you really mean think. In our society, I think when we put feel in front of something, it's like a hedge. You can't disagree with my feelings. But if you say, I feel that, you're not doing feeling, you're doing thinking or believing or something else. So I will circle those, and so will.
I always do as well. And it's a common error, and I do agree with Mary. I think it's because we do, especially in our society, it is a way to hedge your bet. I can't argue with you if you don't say that's how you think or believe, so that's one. I also had a number of students who were not clear on when we use apostrophe S versus plural. So keep in mind that apostrophe S is a possessive. It typically then belongs to something else, and it's not used every time we have a word that ends in an S. So we just want to be careful with that as well.
Okay, anything else?
No, I think we've addressed some of
Okay,
these.
now here's what we want you to do. You have these kinds of notes on your feedback. We'll be distressed if we see the same problems on the second case, because that says to us our feedback wasn't effective. So I would encourage you, once you've written case 2, go back and check what we gave you feedback on, and if you're still doing that where it should be who, just go back and fix it. It's a good way to learn and to reinforce the feedback that you get from whoever your feedback person is. Okay? Then, okay, in your packet today you have, I think it's a green sheet. It's close to